too. But good evening, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot. I'm the Director of Events at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And thank you all so much for spending your Friday evening with us for this book event. Just before we begin, I have a few technical things to go over. First, we will drop a link in the chat so you can purchase a copy of In the Field, as well as Susan Shreve's latest book. And you can get those straight from Politics and Prose's website. We ship to anywhere in the United States, and if you live in the DC area, you can actually select in-store pickup from any of our 3 store locations around the district. Next, if you have a question for our author or our moderator, please submit it in the Q&A space, and we will get to those in the latter portion of the program. You can submit your questions at any point between now and the end of the event, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Okay, now on to the program. I am so excited to introduce these 2 amazing writers tonight, and I think this is going to be an amazing conversation. So first up, Rachel Pastan is a member of the core faculty of the Bennington Writers Seminar MFA program and the editor of the Swarthmorian, a small town newspaper. Her new novel, In the Field, explores what it takes to triumph in the ruthless world of the mid-20th century genetics, following Kate as she decides what she is and is not willing to sacrifice to succeed. Moderating this conversation is Susan Shreve, who was actually my thesis advisor in my MFA program, and I am so happy to have her join us tonight. Susan is the author of over 15 literary works, most recently, You Are the Love of My Life and More News Tomorrow. She was the co-founder and professor in the Master of Fine Arts program at George Mason University for more than 40 years. And in 1985, she co-founded the Penn Faulkner Foundation and served 30 years, most recently as chairman. So thank you all again for being here, and please help me welcome these wonderful writers onto your screens.
Thanks, Brittany. I am thrilled to be here with Rachel Pastan, who I've known for a very long time, both as a writer and as a little girl who grew up and became that writer. This book I love, In the Field, is a wonderful book about a very strong-minded girl when we first meet her, named Kate, who wants to go to college. Her mother thinks it's a bad idea, an unnecessary idea, to go to college when you're a woman. And she persists, as she persists through this whole book, in an amazing and very focused way, and goes to Cornell, where she becomes part of a group of students studying, in her case, genetics, but scientists, a group of scientists. What I particularly love about this book is it's a very character-centered book. Each of the characters become people that you feel that you know very well. And it's what I loved about the work of Virginia Woolf and what I work to do in my own, and what Rachel has done beautifully. So the first question that I am going to ask, I'm going to ask after Rachel reads a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brittany and Susan and Politics and Prose. Usually when I have a novel come out, the reading, I've always given a reading at Politics and Prose, and it's always the highlight of all the readings that I do. So even though I'm here at my house outside of Philadelphia, it's still nice to feel connected to the store and to the DC community. So thanks to all of you for coming. I am going to read a little bit. I'm going to read the very opening of the book, which is a prologue. So as Susan said, the book starts in chapter 1. It starts with Kate when she's 18 years old, but this prologue starts way in the future. So 1982. In summer at that hour, she would have been out in the cornfield already. Hot green smell of rising stalks, sharp blades of dew-damp leaves, wasps buzzing. But it was October now and dark. Kate had always been a light sleeper, an early riser, eager for what the day might bring. Often wakeful and restless, she wandered down to the lab in the heavy stillness of 3 a.m. She kept a cot there among the shelves of microscope slides and back issues of genetics, in case she got sleepy and didn't want to bother coming back upstairs. After an hour's doze, she'd wake with her mind clear as though scrubbed, the work waiting. This morning though, 5:20 by the stove clock, she was upstairs in the apartment kitchen when the phone rang. Drinking coffee in her old seersucker robe, her round steel glasses polished with a carefully pressed handkerchief, she was absorbed in an article about yeast. Some days lately, her mind felt sticky, a swollen door she had to tug open. But today it was working fine. When the phone rang, a loud, bright trill intruding on the humming silence, she glanced at it darkly. What kind of person called at the crack of dawn? Two parallel answers, like two parallel streams of bubbles in an aquarium, bloomed in her gut and rose. But if someone had died, who could it be? Nearly everyone she'd ever loved was dead already. As for the other, well, it was October. She lifted the heavy, cold receiver to her ear. Hello, she barked. Is this Dr. Kathleen Croft? A male voice said, melodic, affable, vaguely foreign. I have some very good news. The words clogged and confused her brain. They were like lights stuttering in the darkness and then going out. Then he told her what he called to tell her, her work, an award, recognition long overdue. Afterwards, she couldn't remember what he'd said exactly. The old ghostly voices swirled around her as if trying to drown him out. Her mother's, it's a waste of money to send a girl to college. Dr. Krause's, young women don't take this work seriously. Hiram Cole, science is not something to pass the time with until you get married. The committee had recognized her discovery nearly half a century earlier that genes could move from place to place on the chromosome, something that had come as quite a surprise. Well, that was true enough. But nowhere in the citation was the significance of her discovery mentioned, the true significance that she, leaping from sight to insight, had understood long ago, that genes did not absolutely determine what an organism would be. It was as though you celebrated Thomas Edison for making a filament of carbon incandescent without explaining what the thing did, light up a dark room.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. And there are two things here. But one is the fact that when Rachel began this book, she had been thinking, I think you read an obituary of Barbara Mcclintock, who did win the Nobel Prize, the first woman in genetics. How is it that you started with her, and what relationship does she have to Kate in terms of your thinking? Because I'm sure that in the obituary, you went from that to all the really excellent research you've done in this book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the character Kate is very much based on Barbara Mcclintock, who did win the Nobel Prize in 1983 for the discovery that genes move around on chromosomes. And I had been thinking, so she died in 1992. So, and I first heard of her when I read that obituary in the New York Times. So I've been thinking about this project for a long time. And I had been thinking in those days, so I'm the daughter of a scientist. I'm also married to a scientist. And I think scientists are really interesting people whose minds often work in very interesting ways, not unlike artists in many ways, but also very unlike them in other ways. And I was thinking about the ways that, especially for women in the sciences, that for women in science, they have experienced a very particular version of the obstacles that women have faced in all the professions and in all kinds of ways in terms of being ambitious and doing work. And I felt that scientists, science is dedicated to truth and objectivity, and yet still, they were still all of these crazy making and crazy obstacles. So I thought writing about a woman in science would be an interesting way of sort of looking at the sort of courage that women have had throughout the 20th and 21st centuries as they've made the steps that we've made. So I was looking around, I read the stories of a bunch of different scientists, women scientists. I read interviews, I read biographies, but there was something about this obituary about Barbara Mcclintock that just was so interesting to me. And partly it was the story of someone who was really, in a lot of ways, very much ahead of her time, who saw something that it took a long time to persuade the scientific community was important, was right, was important. And there's lots of these stories in science among men and women. And Mcclintock's story turned out to be a little bit more complicated than that. But this idea of having this insight, not being believed, going and working in isolation for 20 years and eventually having a kind of redemption was a sort of beautiful place to begin the idea of a novel. And she herself was a very, I don't know if eccentric is the right word, that's a little dismissive, but she was someone, it said in the obituary, she didn't get a telephone put in until 1982. She was someone who, she was interested in Buddhism. She was interested in things in the universe that were mysteries that were sort of science wasn't looking at. And she was sort of proud of her eccentricities in some ways. She never married. She seemed like somebody who really completely devoted her life to her work. And I was interested in the cost of that, the way a person would get there. And that's very much one of the themes in this book is do you have to give up intimacy to do work like that? If you're a woman in genetics in the middle of the 20th century, do you not? So those questions just really sparked something that lay a little bit dormant in a file folder. I cut it out, I cut the obituary out, I put it in a file folder, and I took it out when I was ready. Well,
she was a great model for you to create. Your character, who is both incredibly smart, devoted, very much in the sense of having a mission for herself, her own pleasure and satisfaction, and scientific contribution. And she is also fierce and difficult. And her name is Kate. And my sense is that she knows what she wants. She's very complicated, she's difficult. And part of the excitement of this book is that she is difficult. She's kind of interested in relationships, and she has them with men and women, but she is very complicated in the way in which she deals with them. So she becomes a sympathetic character, not just because of her fierce devotion to her mission in genetics, but also because of her walking into these little traps that she creates for herself. And I kind of loved it about her. She's very loyal. And I found these things attractive and interesting, which brings me to the whole question of the world you create in the lab at Cornell. where she does go to Cornell. And I think I'm right in this, Rachel, that Cornell is a place where a lot of that kind of research happens, right? I know that.
Yeah.
And the lab itself is intense. Everybody is fixed on their work and also fixed on beating the odds, fixed on winning, competitive with one another, even though they may not be after the same particular goal. And she actually seemed to me to be above that. And or maybe not above that, but to the side of it, because she was after what was in her head, what she was discovering, what she was learning. And that is, as far as I found in reading this book, because I couldn't put it down. That's what everybody wants to say about our books that we write. I just couldn't put it down. And doesn't happen very often, but I couldn't put Enfield down. And I couldn't put it down because of these relationships with these various characters in the lab. And the tensions with the faculty and the inner workings of each individual character that you created, Rachel. And I know that you said that at some point I've read, or you said aloud, that Virginia Woolf was a real mentor to you as a writer. And I think that when you think of Virginia Woolf, what you think of is her amazing ability to create characters that create the plot. Mm. And this particular book, in which you could see the opportunity to write a really plotted book, mm-hmm. That's not the energy of this novel. The energy of this novel is in the competition and the interior conflicts. Kate has relationships with a number of people, with a number of men and women. She gets involved in some ways. She sort of sabotages herself, but she also has a lot of affection, a lot of respect. It's an interesting lab and a very intense one. And that's why I found that it was difficult to put down. And I was thinking about what every writer thinks about, because what you want a reader to do is turn the pages. And if the reader doesn't turn the pages, my husband was a literary agent. And so many times I saw him beginning to read a manuscript and then he'd put it down and he didn't go back. So if you don't write something which people continue to turn the pages, then that's a frustration for you and the reader. And I was anxious to turn the pages here. And I think it's really locked into the tensions with character. And I wanted you, because it's not a plotted book. In a way, you see from what Rachel read at the beginning that you know she got an award at the end and you kind of know what it was. So you know the end and you see her working, but that does not interrupt the tension that these characters in the lab have created.
So yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting stuff about plot sort of under the surface in what you said and in those questions that are buried in what you said. And I mean, you and I have both taught fiction writing a lot also. And for me as a teacher, I'm really interested in talking about plot with my students partly because plot took me so long as a writer to learn how to manage, to learn how to think about, to internalize. And so you talk about Virginia Woolf. So I think of a novel like Mrs. Dalloway as a novel that has like the thinnest possible spider web thread of plot that you could hang a novel on. still have it be in some way a plot. So at the beginning, we know there will be a party. The question is, will the party succeed or not? And at the end, we're at the party and we see it succeed. At the beginning, the question is raised, does Clarissa regret having married the man she married instead of the other guy? Or maybe even a third person. And then by the end, she sort of thought through the answer to that question. So we wonder about some things at the beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, and lots of things sustain us through the course of that book. And then we learn the answers to the things we've been wondering about. And certainly one way to think about plot is making the reader wonder something and then making them wait to find out what it is. And in this book, it takes place over a long period of time. And it, so it's not like the kind of book that's just wrapped around a couple of incidents that take place over a year or 2 years. But there are some big questions I wanted the reader to wonder about at the beginning that it would take the whole course of the book to get to. And there were, along the way, I was always asking myself, chapter to chapter, scene to scene, what is the reader wondering about here? And if there was nothing, then it would be like, okay, so that scene's not working. So the reader needs to be wondering about something. And that's a question I'm always asking myself. So in this chapter, what is the reader wondering about? I often make the mistake in early drafts of answering that question really quickly. And then I look back and I'm like, no, they gotta wait longer than that, right? They have to wait 3 pages or 6 pages or 25 pages or whatever it is. So that's just that's just a technical thing, right? But the bigger question of what the overarching, I don't know, plot story of the book is, as you say, we know from the very beginning, we know from the prologue that Kate is going to win this prize. So in that way, she's going to succeed in what she's struggling to succeed at throughout the book. But there are things we don't know. We don't know what she's going to have to sacrifice to get there, what she's willing to sacrifice to get there, what the cost will be. So I think one of the things I hope readers will be wondering about throughout the course of the book is, how big a price will she have to pay? What will paying it look like? So that's one thing. I also often think when I'm working on a novel or helping students work on novels that it's helpful, it's not necessary, but it's helpful to be writing towards something, not necessarily an event, but some sort of choice that your character is going to have to make. So, and I know what the choice will be. I know what the choice is. I don't know which choice will be made. And so with Kate, I knew in my head for a long time what the choice was going to be that she was going to have to make. Often it's a big moral choice. In this case, to not give too much away, she has to decide, she has to figure out what she's willing to do for someone she's close to at the end. And I think that everything that happens in the book up until that point determines the choice that she's going to make, or determines the terms of the choice that she has in front of her. And then the choice that she makes takes us to the last things that happen in the book, that the very last things that happen because of that moral choice that she makes on page, whatever it is, 95% of the way through the book or 90% of the way through the book. So that's another way that I think about plot in a sort of macro way. And then I'll say one more thing, which is, so again, as you said, we know at the very beginning that she's going to win this prize. So that's not a mystery. We're not wondering about that. So the question we're asking, or one of the questions we're asking, is a character question. It's, how is she going to become the person who wins that prize? How is she going to become the person who does that work? How is she going to make it through all the obstacles she's going to need to make it through? And one of the central questions that her work explores is how do organisms become what they become? So we start with our complement of genes, we have a particular environment, and then an organism, she works with corn, so you have a corn kernel and you plant it, you fertilize it, and it grows to be a certain kind of corn plant. How does that happen? That is the mystery that she spends her whole life trying to answer. And so I'm trying to work on two levels at once, to watch Kate try to figure out, how does an organism become what it becomes? And she's also very consciously thinking about that question a lot, both in terms of science and in terms of her own life. How do people become who we become? How is it determined who we love? How is it determined what work we're interested in? She's looking at the other creatures around her. She's looking at the dog, and who doesn't want to go out in the rain, and saying, why is the dog, why does that dog want to go out in the rain and that other dog doesn't? Is it in the genes? Is it in the environment? What is it in? So she's always asking that. And for me, that was the sort of central organizing metaphor of the book, was that question. And so it was, and I set that up by the fact that at the beginning that she's going to get there. So the question is the question she's asking, which is how.
I also feel, and that's great, and I'm glad you really sort of spoke like a novelist in how one creates a novel, which is not easy, though one wishes it were. But the other thing that happens in this novel is it's very woven, and all the people that you meet throughout reappear, and you have this sense of a growing world that is the world you're in, but it's growing all the time. And I thought that was depth, the way you did that. It was really well done. It made me feel like a group of people I'd walked in on and then walked out and then walked in 2 years later, and they were all there and there were similar things happening, and I felt at home. So it's a novel in which you feel at home. You feel that these people, gradually what they're going to do, and they are very, all of them, as scientists would be, I assume. And I should ask you, what is your background in science besides around the dinner table?
Oh, I have no background in science.
And did you have any interest until this?
No, not that much. So I'm interested in sort of natural history a little bit, like what bird is that? What wildflower is that? I'm interested in those things intermittently, but I can't really sustain my interest long enough to actually learn more than like 8 of the wildflowers and like 3 of the bird songs. But and Kate also is very interested in those things, so it's fun to go out and wander around with her and see what she sees, and like look things up, look up what weeds would be in the margin of the road in New York State when you were driving somewhere. But one of the pleasures of this book, so I grew up in Washington, D.C. My dad works at the National Institutes of Health. He is a geneticist. He is still working, and he one of the things that was really fun about writing this book was getting to consult with him about what I was trying to learn. And right at the beginning, I asked him, I was like, do you think I can learn the genetics that I need to learn to write this book? And he was like, oh, yes. But actually, it was really hard for me to learn the genetics, even though it was the genetics that was being taught in 1930. Like, I went to the Swarthmore College Library and I got an old textbook out, like the textbook that people would have used at, probably at Cornell, at a lot of places in the 20s. So that was really fun, with these like old photographs of like rats and guinea pigs and all their different colors and this very dense text. But when I got stuck or I had a question, I could ask my dad so one of the things I really wanted to do in the book was make it really be about the science, not just be a book about a scientist, but really about just her personal life, or really about whatever. I really wanted it to be about the science as well as about her personal life. But how to convey the science in a way that would be interesting and meaningful to people who aren't scientists. And so finding the right metaphors, being inside Kate's head when she's doing certain things, that was really a lot of what the challenge was that I set up for myself. And then I could show that stuff to my dad sometimes and be like, so did I get this right? Like, does this make sense? Does this metaphor work? And it helped me. I got to a point where I could understand, at least for a while, what some of his most important science was, which I had never understood clearly before, and which I have to say the details are already fading, but for a while I got it really clearly. And that was really wonderful too, a sort of extra, an extra sort of sidelight pleasure for me in writing this book.
That's great, and you can see that. And one of the things that I found was a certain delight that you communicated through Kate, but you had to feel it yourself as things were working out and presenting themselves, and as she better understood and could explain what was going on. And that really was beautifully done. And I can't say that I grew up with any science at all, or past any science that I took, but I'm still sort of the mystery of it, the competition within the lab, things like that are both familiar to us and unfamiliar, but really interesting. I found that compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you would read a piece of the group, or any sort of piece that you might like that shows the larger picture.
I thought actually what I would read next would be something from when Kate is just starting to go to college, and starting to take the first biology class. And this is a little bit about the science, but really it's mostly about the relationship. So, but anyway, so you'll see. So a few pages from her early life, having started with her later life. Kate had signed up for Introduction to Biology back in September because her housemate, Thea, was taking it, and she wanted Kate to take it too. Otherwise, I'll be the only one, she said. Thea was taller than Kate, pale and gray-eyed in her plaid pleated jumpers. A long braid hung down her back, bouncing and swaying when she walked, the strands almost blonde where the light caught them. The only what? Kate asked. Girl, Thea said. Those classes have 100 people in them, Kate said. But she signed up anyway, and it turned out Thea was right. They were the only two. They were freshmen, and it was 1923. 3 times a week, they sat next to each other in the front of the big, musty auditorium. Thea insisted they sit in the first row. She was from Manhattan. Her father was a classics professor. And unlike Kate's, her family had encouraged her to go to college. My father said it was a good idea as long as I didn't think I could learn Greek, Thea said. Kate's father, a physician, had died in France in the war at the age of 40 when Kate was 12. Before that, at home in Brooklyn, he liked to walk out into the countryside with his field glasses, looking at trees and birds and butterflies, and once in a while, taking Kate with him. She liked to think he would have been happy to see her go off to Cornell, whereas her mother, when the train to Ithaca was called, had pressed her lips together in a thin line like a bobby pin and said, "Try not to embarrass yourself." Kate loved the house on Myrtle Street, which she shared with Thea and another girl, Lena. She loved its wooden floors, which were mostly bare, and its plain white walls, so different from her mother's fussy wallpapers. She loved the acorn-shaped finial at the bottom of the banister, the wood worn to satin by anonymous hands. She even liked the cupboard-sized room Thea showed her when she answered the ad, into which a bed and a chest of drawers had somehow been crammed. From the doorway, A single high window looked out on a neighbor's brick wall. It's not a beautiful view, Thea conceded as they stood together looking up. But Kate was determined to find everything about her new life lovely. She threw herself down on the coverlet, which exhaled a cloud of golden dust, and tucked her arms behind her. From here, the window was a rectangle of pure blue. Her mind drifted, steeping itself in color. It is from here, she said. Thea came over and sat on the edge of the bed to see what Kate was seeing. Blue is my favorite color, she said, looking up at the rectangle of sky. What's yours? Blue. Kate shut her eyes. Sometimes her body felt too small to contain everything roiling inside it, and she had to shut things out so she wouldn't burst. Thea knew about all kinds of things: Freud, Galileo, Yiddish theater. When Thea was thinking something through, she went so still she almost ceased to breathe. And when she was excited by an idea, her shoulders flared backward and her face flushed, and she tugged violently at her braid. For example, when Kate mentioned that she planned never to have children, Thea pulled on her braid and cried, "Don't be silly, of course you are." "Why, of course," Kate retorted, "if I don't want to?" "Why wouldn't you want to? It's the one thing in the world that's better about being a girl," Thea said. Kate, who had been lining up her arguments, began to laugh. It was so much the sort of thing she might have said herself. "Women without children always look so mournful, like hungry wolves," Thea said. "I wouldn't mind being a wolf." Kate was afraid of lightning and of suffocation, of being buried alive, but she wasn't afraid of being hungry. "Babies are sticky," she said, "and children are always whining about something." "You'll change your mind," Thea said. Kate glared. This sudden primness, the open flower of Thea's face gone chilly as though made of silk, did not suit her. "I won't," she said. "Why should I?" "You sound like my sister Hannah," Thea said. "Eat your carrots." "I won't." "Wash your hands before you set the table." "Why should I?" "That's a stupid comparison," Kate said. "There's a good reason to wash your hands before you set the table." But she saw that Thea's eyes were full of tears. Kate touched her friend's wrist. It was sharp and soft at the same time, the stem of a leaf, a milkweed pod. "What is it?" she said. "I miss them," Thea said. "I've shared a room with Hannah all my life. Here, sometimes I wake up because Lena breathes so differently." Lena and Thea shared the big bedroom down the hall from Kate's. Kate didn't miss her family. Even before her father died, she had felt stifled and out of place in that dark Brooklyn house. "I guess everyone breathes in his own particular way," she said, "like fingerprints." Thea smiled even though she was still crying. "Or snowflakes," she said. "Pine cones," Kate said. There was a flutter in her chest as though a moth were trying to get out. She'd never had a friend like this before, someone she didn't get bored with and make excuses to get away from, preferring, in the end, to be alone.
And that captures, I think, first of all, you heard what a beautiful writer Rachel is. You can really hear that in that very lyrical relationship between the two of them. But you also capture at the end of that what Kate is, her sense of complete commitment to what she's looking for, to being a scientist, constantly working, constantly on the job, constantly thinking about it, and her romantic sensibility, which she does have, and a kind of kindness that doesn't always appear. She can get herself, she's very complicated, she can get herself into a lot of trouble. She can certainly trouble in relationships and trouble with working with people. She's a solo worker. It's a solo profession, but not entirely. But I think that you really captured something in Kate that captured me, which was the places, the soft places.
Mhm.
And Thea reappears much, much later. And Thea has that sensibility by nature. Kate doesn't, but it shows itself again and again. And it does in her relationship with men as well. And I was very interested in two characters, the character of Thatch, who seems like such a good guy, but he's more than a good guy. He's really a good guy. And the way Kate is in terms of her own capacity for friendship. And Paul, who's another, who also won the Nobel in the book. Paul, who's another scientist who's very successful and becomes very successful, is not as pleasant, not as kind, but Kate has very warm feelings about him and is very kind about him. So she becomes, for all her difficulty, for all of her obsessional capacity to be a scientist, and also her quick temper and her willingness to fight, she becomes a very complex and interesting and captivating character who I really liked a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, the two guys, I mean, so she, in the book, she and Thatch and Paul are very close when they're in graduate school. And Thatch is definitely a much nicer person than Paul is. If there is a villain in the book, it probably is Paul, although he does some villainous things. I don't think he's the villain. But she, and a lot of people are like, Kate, why do you keep going back and being friends with him and doing work with him? And she does, for better and for worse. But I think what I was interested in about her was that there was a part of her that didn't care about who was nice and who wasn't nice.
Right.
Part of her cared, but another part of her was like, he's incredibly smart. He's extremely interesting. He's powerful, and maybe even more than anything, Paul is one of the few people in the book who sees her in a way that other people don't. So one of the things that the themes of the book is Kate coming to understand her own sexuality, that she's gay, mostly, maybe entirely, and how much she has to hide that or decides to hide that. And there are people who are very close to her who never see it. And Paul sees it because he is looking at her. And I think there's something about that being seen, that she's willing to overlook a lot to be in relationship with somebody who sees her, even if he also takes advantage of her in a lot of ways too.
Right, and that's what we want. We want to be seen.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, and I think it's also true that she's interested in Paul. She's interested in Paul for a lot of reasons. So these characters are really very strong characters, and I think that the way in which, and I wondered about this, did you know when you started the book how it was going to move forward? Moving forward is one of those things that is difficult, but it covers a lot of years. It covers the years when she went to Cornell until she wins the Nobel, and it covers many of the same people. Did you know how you were going to do that? Were you ever stuck in writing this book? Or did it, because of its beginning, and I always feel about a novel, that incredible frustration is, do I have a beginning that's going to take this to the end? So did you have any problems with that as you moved through this book?
So the very first draft of this book had a double story. It had Kate's story, and then it had a niece who was living on a commune in Massachusetts and dabbling in witchcraft, who went to stay with her aunt. her eminent aunt and sort of uncovered her aunt's story. So that was the, I don't know what the word for the draft that like teaches you stuff, but you have to throw it away because it's terrible. But when I think about that niece character was in some ways a surrogate for me as I did my research to try to figure out things about Barbara Mcclintock that I could use or change or shift for Kate. And so I just want to tell the story about that. Turns out Barbara Mcclintock's papers are at the American Philosophical Society here in Philadelphia. And so I went there and I did research, which was, some of it was very interesting, but it turned out that she had destroyed all of her correspondence before 1970. Why would a person do that? You ask yourself. And then if you're a fiction writer, your mind starts spinning. Not absolutely all of it. There were a few letters that survived. Some of them were interesting. Some of them were less interesting. Then there was this box of photographs. And the photographs were mostly labeled on the back. You know, this is me and my sister. This is me and such a scientist. This is Cold Spring Harbor. And then at the bottom of the box, there was this biggish photograph, sort of 4x6, mounted on cardboard. There were a series of them. There were 3 of them, I think, of this elegant woman wearing slacks and a sweater, sort of sitting in a meadow, looking at the camera. No markings on it, no indication of who this was. And for me, just lifting it out of the box was this moment of, I don't know who this is. I can't know who this is, but I know who I feel that this person could be in relation to this woman who saved this photograph. And that was it was a very powerful moment for me. And so I wanted to put it in the book. So I wanted to give it to the niece to find this in the box. But again, that's a sort of first drafty thing where it's like, no, like I did that. It happened to me. It informs what I have decided to make the book into, but it doesn't need to be in the book. So
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it was a very, very long road to get to any kind of version of this book that's like the book as it ended up. But the main question, once I had the basic shape, really was the question of the ending. Okay, so we know she wins the Nobel, but does she end up alone? Does she end up with someone? Is there some room in there? And I wrote several versions. The version I thought was the right version was not the version that my early readers thought was the right version. And so, you know, I think this question of what you think as the writer is the right answer, often that's the right answer. But when you hear the world talking to you and saying, that's not the answer that we want some other answer. So I think about, so what does that conversation between the original impulse and then the response of the world and what you do with that conversation? So working that out was a big part of what I had to do in shaping the trajectory of the book.
Right, those are difficult things because I think that you get wedded to certain things.
Yeah.
And I know that I tend not to show them because I don't want anybody to tell me to take them out. I find that interesting. That's a pretty astonishing story, finding that photograph as you did, because it leads to all kinds of conjectures and actually is very powerful.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing too. I saw that my incredible editor at Delphinium, Joe, is here. Joe, thank you for coming. And one of the things that Joe said about the book after they had agreed to publish it was that there's a scene towards the end, there's a grant review scene. And he was like, more needs to happen in this scene. And I was like, I don't want more to happen, right? It's like, I don't want it to be like a big crescendo. And he was like, it doesn't have to be a big crescendo, but it has to be more than it is now. And I felt like that for me was one of the most useful notes I got in the whole years-long process of writing this book. And so reworking that scene and making that scene into something where something happened more than, nothing happening. Something really happened in it, right towards the end, right as the sort of beginning of the end, was really important. So, so many readers over so many years with so many, moments of saying, but think about this, or, you write the novel and it's your novel, but there's so many people, for most of us, whose voices are absolutely crucial in making it what it ultimately is.
Right. No, this is true. And I think that I did not get an MFA, and so I didn't have that particular initial troop of readers. And it took me a long time to figure that out without it. And I think it's very good to have these readers, even if you don't like what they say. But this is a wonderful novel, Rachel. I'm so, it felt smart to me, which is to say, I felt smarter reading it. In the ability that you have to bring your reader in to a world that most of us are not familiar with. It's certainly imaginable, but it is a beautiful read, and thank you.
Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to get to some of the questions that you all submitted in the Q&A. So I love this question from Anna Curtis. She says, you mentioned that you picked back up the file folder, quote, when you were ready. How did you know when you were ready? Did you always know you'd come back to it?
Hi, Anna. It's great to not be able to see you, but to know that you're there. So actually that's not true. It wasn't when I was ready. It was when when it was time to write another book and I didn't know what it was going to be, actually, is the real answer to that question. And I didn't mean to obfuscate or lie about it, but it was not the point of what I was saying when I said that thing. But yeah, at a certain point, so I'd written, I had published a novel that was about the contemporary art world, Elena, and I felt like I wanted to sort of make the jump from writing about art to writing about science. And I was like, well, what is in that folder? Is that folder still around someplace? Can I find it? And it was, and actually it's a folder of many obituaries of many interesting women. So yeah, so for many years I've been clipping obituaries of interesting women out of the New York Times and putting them in this folder. And so, yeah, so some of them were archaeologists, or I don't remember what the other ones were, who they were. But that was when I came on it, and there's just something about her, even her face, looking at her, where I don't remember now because it was 8 years ago, where I was like, yeah, okay, I think it's time to write this. I think it's time to write this story.
Hilma Wolitzer says, Rachel, I love this book, and Susan, I love your reading of it. Rachel, you clearly researched the science. Did this allow you more latitude for invention in her private/inner life?
Hilma, thank you. So I do feel, it's complicated taking the life of a real person and making it into fiction. And there is a little author's note at the beginning of this book that sort of talks about the relationship between this character and Barbara Mcclintock and some of the other characters and real people that they were based on. But I did really want the science to be right. And I think that's exactly right, Hilma, that it was like this sense that the science will be right, or at least as right as I can make it. And then, so if the life isn't right, if the life isn't, when I was doing the research, I tried not to meet very many people who had known Mcclintock. I did meet a few of them, but I didn't want to feel beholden to them and to what they had told me. Some of them told me some great stories. And I wanted the essence of this character to be true enough to my belief, my sense of who Mcclintock was, that people who knew her would read it and be like, yeah, okay, it's a fictionalization, but there's something about it that's true. But I think I was buying myself some latitude with the fidelity in the other realm. Yeah.
So there are two questions that are a little bit similar, Jean and Anne. So Anne says that she writes poetry. Her husband is physicist. And she has learned that poetry and science are all one word. It sounds like you've realized the way artists and scientists have deep similarities as well. How does this play out for Kate? And then Jean says, can you talk about the parallels and the contrast between the way scientists and artists might think and observe?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting and hard question. I mean, so there's a thing that is in Kate's head in the prologue that I read at the beginning of this, where I say moving from sight to insight. And I think one of the things that Kate is really good at, and this was true of Mcclintock, was she can see things in the microscope that other people can't see. So she might look through your microscope and say, hey, do you, that's what's going on there. And people used to get really mad at Mcclintock, like, stop interpreting my data. It's like, well, I can see the thing in the microscope that you're not seeing. And so that's amazing. And that's a skill that's really, really helpful to Kate, is what she can see. And in early discovery she makes, she's the first person to be able to see all the chromosomes of corn and be able to describe them. And that was a very important work that she did early on. But that's not enough, right? It's not enough just to be able to see it, but to see it and then to understand the implications, or what the implications might be, and to see where to take it. And then to think extremely, I hope I'm getting this right, because I want to say if I've learned one thing about science from my father, it is, so I hope this is true, that understanding how to take an idea you have and craft an experiment that's really simple and clear is really, really important skill that a lot of people don't have. So first she sees the thing, and then she has these ideas about what the implications could be, and then she's able to gather data in a way that's extremely disciplined and potent. So artists don't have to do the really disciplined and potent part of that. I mean, we're disciplined in our own ways, of course, but there's just so much room for just making stuff up, right? I mean, that's just so basic. We get to make stuff up and they don't get to make anything up, I think that's incredible that they do the work that they do with all those constraints. We have our own kind of constraints, but both of us, both categories of people, artists and scientists, are starting with looking at the world, looking at people, looking at nature, looking at the interplay between them, and saying, what can I imagine that's not in the world yet that could be of interest and be meaningful? But we do it in different ways.
This isn't a question, but Joseph in the chat just said, I've read this novel 4 times, and listening to Rachel reading it, I feel as though I am hearing it and discovering it for the very first time. And I just thought that was really lovely. And if you would like to read this novel 4 times, or even just once, there are links in the chat for you to get the book from Politics and Prose. So please check that out. We can really only bring you programming like this because of your support of indie bookstores and your sales. So thank you all so much for being here. Susan and Rachel, thank you, of course, for spending your evening with us. And I hope everyone stays safe and stays well and stays well read. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Rachel.